This is House Planning Help, episode 322. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build or retrofit. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up, Guy Hargreaves returns to the podcast. He was retrofitting his Victorian mid-terrace property to Passive House standard. We follow construction because that's where the last podcast left off, just as that was about to begin, all the way through to moving in. And Guy has been fantastic in sharing the journey in our membership community, The Hub. We've been turning around videos of this project for months. We're getting towards the back end of it now, which is quite good to have another complete in-depth video case study, this time of a retrofit. And I've seen it all with my own eyes, so can't wait to get into today's chat. Also, Guy has already opened the doors of his property to a local eco group just to show them what he's done in terms of trying to upgrade his house, trying to incorporate renewables. So I thought this might be a good point to mention the International Passive House Open Days, because it's coming up as we release this podcast. But if you miss it now, twice a year, there's this big international event, and there's bound to be a project near you, or even if there isn't, perhaps it's a good excuse to go and explore either a new build or retrofit, just so you can understand exactly what that means. You're bound to know something about it, but I always think if you haven't been into one before you get going on the journey, well, this is the perfect opportunity. So we'll put a link in the show notes today to the Passive House Open Days. All right, then let's get into our interview with Guy Hargreaves. And this is a part 2. So if you haven't heard part 1, it will probably make sense. houseplanninghelp.com/297 start there. But what we're going to focus on today is the construction stage all the way through to moving in. So they've added space at the back of the property. They moved out for a number of months. And also the basement. Yeah, that's quite a key fact. They've separated that. It's going to be a standalone apartment that they can then rent out. So Guy and Susan have returned to the house, and that's where we begin this chat. I say to Guy, what does it feel like to be back?
It's a mixture of emotions in a lot of ways. A relief that we're 99.9% of the way through. There's a little bit of numbness about the stress of the process. I'd be lying to say it hasn't taken its emotional toll on me, because it really was unbelievably difficult. So overwhelming relief that we are through, that we've got our air tightness results and that we're on our way to getting certified. And in a lot of ways, a feeling of great pride that we've managed to, pull off such a difficult assignment. And I think we've done a fantastic job on it.
Let's go back. And we're going to pick up where we left the last podcast. And I'll just remind you where that was. Construction was just about to begin. So what happens at the beginning of the process?
So the build kicked off in earnest in early February, first week of February. And the first thing was the knocking down of the section at the rear, the gutting of the place, and preparing for putting steels in so that we could pull walls down. And so the first phase was deconstruction. And once we got to the bottom of the deconstruction cycle, it was all uphill from there.
But that was quite a lengthy process, wasn't it? It's not just a week of taking things out, because you have to do it slowly. And you had access issues here as well, didn't you?
Well, yes, in theory, our access was limited to the front door. But as things went on, we managed to negotiate access through the rear, through a private car park owned by a whole series of flats on an adjacent road. And we negotiated that through the manager of the car park. And she was very kind and patient with us and let a lot of our contractors come through towards the end. And in return, we completely resurfaced the car park and remetalled it and replaced the light and the fence, and the car park is a lot better condition now than when we first arrived. So I think it was a win-win.
Was there a measure of how many truckloads or what weight of material came out of the building?
Oh, it was in the tens of tons of base that we dug out to make the rear foundations. So the rear foundations consisted of a concrete pour followed by an insulation layer, followed by another floating concrete slab. So we had 2 concrete pours during the job. We had an excavator that dug out the foundations. It was a little digger, actually, and it was craned in from the rear car park over probably a 15-metre high apple tree. So there was some very interesting crane lifts on this job, I have to say.
And it wasn't just that, it's operating in a very tiny little space, filling up barrow loads that had to, as you say, be taken out at the front door to where the truck was, and just, again, a slow process.
Yes, exactly. So the base that was hauled out was literally hauled out in plastic. They almost looked like clothes bins, and they were literally carried out by hand and put onto a truck out the front and driven off. So there was a lot of hand excavation, a lot of labour work that was involved with that at the early beginning.
Those steels then, why were they being brought to site?
We removed 2 significant walls on the ground floor. To replace them, we had to put some steels the width of the house. So the width of the property is around about 6 metres. So those really were structural steels holding up the first floor to give us the full open plan experience in the front of the property.
And as we go down in the building, you had this basement. How are you dealing with insulation there? Because you obviously want to go down, but you've got to be careful.
Well, the basement was dug out. On the party wall sides, really we didn't have to do much in terms of insulating. At the external front and rear, we applied the diathanite Gutex lime plaster insulation build-up that we had also in the main house. And the floor, we ended up digging out because it had around about a 75mm screed, which actually gave us a little bit of extra room that we hadn't banked on to add insulation and retain some semblance of reasonable ceiling height. You don't usually often get great ceiling height in a basement, and we probably have ended up with ceiling heights of 2.1 metres or so. Certainly not the 2.5 to 2.7 metre ceiling heights we've got in the rest of the house. And obviously the ceiling of the basement is the floor at the main house, and so no insulation was required there. The floor of the basement, we ended up putting 40mm Celotex as insulation into it, and that seemed to work with the modelling.
It's a historic building, and that front facade facing the street couldn't really change, but it wasn't in great condition, was it? And that bay, did they do a survey of it?
Well, actually, when we bought the house, we had a light survey done, but we didn't really do a full survey, and a full survey probably would have found that bay was not particularly well founded, because all of these properties sit really on an earth foundation. There was no concrete foundations, and these things were built in the late 19th century. So that whole front was kind of falling in, and you could tell once you started looking closely at the sandstone surrounding the windows that there was cracks appearing and whatnot. And it turned out that we needed to strip and rebuild probably half of the bay window. Certainly the ground floor half. We didn't need to do the basement half. This was not a massively expensive thing. It was really just required dismantling the bay window, which needed a bit of scaffolding. The windows were coming out anyway, and finding new bricks and rebuilding it, really. So it wasn't an enormously expensive exercise, and so I was quite relieved about that. Furthermore, though, when we did get down to the basement and started to look at how we were going to leave the external front part of the basement, we realised at that point that there were no concrete foundations underneath that bay window, and so we ended up underpinning it, and it wasn't a huge thing. It was probably 4 metres of concrete underpinning, and in some respects I'm sort of quite grateful that we got it done in a way, because what it effectively does is it keeps the water from going underneath those bricks and giving us a problem internally, and it stabilises that whole front. And we're a mid-terrace, we have a terrace either side, and all 3 terraces kind of rely on each other, the party wall, to hold themselves together to some extent. And so by doing that, we've probably done some positive things for the neighbours in terms of the stability of the front of their houses.
Yeah. When you get this opportunity, I think you've done the right thing in terms of you want this to be the moment that you get everything in order. Let's move now to the back of the property. So this was where you were extending as well, going from the old building, which is brick, into timber frame. Does that present any problems with junctions and so forth?
Well, I think it probably did present some challenges in terms of the junctions, because the old house, you were going from a double brick or 9-inch brick wall, which you needed to insulate in a way that didn't give you condensation risk. And the new part of the house was largely lath and truss, so 300mm lath and truss that were made on site and packed with insulation and then clad with brick or brick slip, depending on where they were. And at the junction, they needed to be connected. Internally, I think they probably achieved that connection through things like service voids and having a consistent material going from the brick to the truss. Externally, there was always a void, and if it was brick slip, it was a cement board brick slip build up that went onto the brick slip, and then there's a mortar joint between it. So I do expect that over time some of those mortar joints might come a little loose. We're probably going to have to look at that in time.
And what's the insulation within the timber frame?
That was a soft wool insulation. To be honest, the exact name of it escapes me. I'd probably have to look it up. There were quite a few different types of insulation used depending on where you were. There was the Kingspan if it was a hard insulation on a flat roof or on a side external wall. There were some softer wool insulations, and there were some hardier, stronger insulations, and then there was the Gutex wood fibre. With the brick walls, we put a diathanite parge on, 20 mils of parge, which provided your air tightness layer as well as some thermal insulation properties, and then we glued 100 mil Gutex wood fibre onto it, and then we finished it with a lime plaster, and that allowed for condensation to be able to flow through that build-up, but gave you air tightness and your thermal properties needed for the modelling.
And we must mention as well that there was work going on in that top room where you were adding a dormer.
Well, actually, there was originally a dormer extension done, but it was one of those extensions where you had roof lights on both sides, and you had your sloping ceiling on both sides. And what we've done is we've kept the sloping ceiling on the north side, on the road side, but we then put a flat roof in to essentially open up that whole side of the room. And then that whole south side we glazed in a rather aggressive and somewhat controversial scheme that is going to be a work in progress over time, because that dormer is the top of the house, and the house is rather open plan nowadays. What tends to happen is that the heat in the house tends to rise into the dormer and add to the solar gain in that dormer.
Now, come on, this must have been a discussion in the early days. I can't imagine Alan or anyone at Eco Design Consultants not saying we would reduce glazing size. So this was driven by you, I'm guessing, in terms of wanting a hot room at the top. Is that part of it?
I wouldn't say that we wanted a hot room, but we wanted a light, open feel room. That's why we glazed it the way we did. We always knew that it was going to be a warm room. We've got plenty of window ventilation options, and we also have a reverse cycle heat pump, which we can use for cooling. But everyone, Alan and Rod Williams, my mechanical engineer, who just did a fantastic job, told us that this was going to be a warm room, and you're going to have to. And we knew that. We just really felt like we would just start with it and see how warm it was, and then just, over time, implementing different strategies to cool it down. So what we're doing right now is we're going to put blinds, block-out blinds, on the inside. Now, we know that that'll have a certain degree of effectiveness, and we'll see what that effectiveness is. But if that room ever really becomes a real problem, the ultimate solution will be to put external blinds in, and we can certainly do that. We're going to start with it as it is, very open, overglazed in the opinion of almost every passive house architect, I would imagine. but
fair enough.
But we haven't done it with our eyes closed. We're well and true. And
that is the most important thing.
And you know what? Literally, that is the only room that overheats. Every other room is absolutely perfect. And so the big future-proofing fear for that room will be when you get these ridiculously high overnight lows. For example, a major city in China recently, they had an overnight low of like 34.9 degrees. Well, there's no ventilation strategy that's going to allow you to sleep in a room that starts off at 35 degrees and you literally can't cool any less. And at that point, you're going to need your reverse cycle heat pumps and the like.
Well, one thing I noticed as we went through this process is you were very involved in it. Now, did you ever feel too involved sometimes? You've obviously got a technical mind, so I know you understand all these things, but I remember certain days I come in and you were looking at particular details, and I was thinking, is that really your concern?
Personally, I think I was more involved. I was certainly more involved than my builder wanted me to be. But I really feel like this was an incredibly challenging project, executed at a very challenging time, and I really feel like if my level of involvement wasn't what it was, which was literally daily down here, really all over it, really, really all over airtightness. A big takeaway for me is that your architects and your passive house designers can specify your insulation strategy, and as long as it's executed reasonably effectively, there's never going to be a complaint. But the airtightness is that's all about like diligence in building. And when you get to a certain point, beyond that point of your build, you're going to take what you get with airtightness. You're not going to be able to get back up into the, underneath the eaves and fix up those holes that they left because they didn't tape two membranes together properly, or that they put 200 screw holes through a membrane, that wasn't secured.
But was this an enjoyment thing? Did you like getting involved? Because if you were taking a step back, you could just say at the airtightness test, this is your responsibility, you need to fix it. Or was it more that you liked that process of, almost you took on a lot of project management roles, didn't you?
Look, I wouldn't say that project management, because I think in the end I was more like quality control, actually.
Quality control.
So it was a combination of my background. I trained as a mechanical engineer. This was like going all the way back to my roots. Not that far. I'm not that old. But, 30 years ago, I was all over the stuff. Heat transfer, HVAC control systems for big buildings, and all sorts of other thermodynamic ideas and learnings. And I loved all that stuff. And sadly, when I got out of university, the labour market was more conducive to financial engineers than it was to actual mechanical engineers. And nowadays, when you get out of university with a mechanical engineering job, you go off and you work for Elon Musk redesigning the automobile industry, and so it's far more interesting. But in a little bit of enjoyment on that sense, a little bit of fear, because I knew that we would get the insulation right, but I had absolutely no idea that we would get the airtightness right. And the airtightness, it's like a stop-go thing, it's like blowing up a balloon. If there's a hole in it, you will get found out. You can't avoid that. And so when I saw the structure on the building site, when I felt like it was not conducive to producing, consistently strong airtightness results, I was very active about it. There were several points where I had even Robert from Seeger, and I had all sorts of people on site with me, and they were maintaining till they're blue in the face that, oh no, that little corner, that was fine. And I said, it is not fine. I saw it being put together, and that will not be fine. And when we pulled it apart, it was definitely not fine. There were definitely large pieces of membrane that had not been taped properly, or taped at all, to be honest. And it would have been a fail. It would have been an airtightness fail right there, and it would have been inside a Larsen truss, on the other side of a Larsen truss, you never would have got to. So that's not to say that I'm pointing the finger or I'm blaming anyone. It was just an unbelievably difficult management process in itself. And you had this really volatile environment where, your labourers would be there one day and down the road the next because they were getting paid 30% more. It was just insane.
when we got to the air tightness test, it was a result of something like 3, was that right? I mean, you obviously have air tightness tests and you know you're going to keep on improving, but the most important thing is to take your time and work out where the leaks are and keep on dealing with them.
Yes. I've learned a lot about how to manage air tightness in developments like this. And I would say that air tightness is a little bit like compliance. The people that are responsible for producing the air tightness results should be almost separate to the actual construction people themselves. They should be coming on site every day and working on air tightness matters. And if a part of the build is going ahead and it's obvious that you need to address air tightness before that build part goes ahead, then that person should point that out. Another thing that we learned that was incredibly valuable was that we had a very good firm doing the air tightness, and we probably did 2 or 3 interim tests, and that wasn't about like trying to get a result 3 times, 4 times, whatever. It was really about pressurizing the fabric and running around with smoke and working out where you had to focus on improving things, and that made a huge difference. But also, when we got up, for example, up to the dormer loft, Faz, the air tightness guy, he was just amazed. He went into that loft and he held his smoke and he said, I cannot believe how airtight this section is. And that was fantastic because that meant, okay, fine, we don't have to focus on that anymore. That we move on from that, right? Here are your problems over here. And so air tightness is really about chasing down your problems. I can't stress highly enough how important it is to have various tests, because there's this dynamic that happens, I'm sure, on a retrofit where your architect wants the air tightness membrane to, effectively be built before anything else happens. No plaster, no nothing, until it's airtight. But on a building site, you just can't schedule things like that. You might end up having a small team on focused on the one last part of the shell, and in the meantime, everything else in the house is not moving forward because we're waiting until this final
sequencing.
Yeah.
And you weren't there material delays or problems or prices?
2/3 of the way through our Kingspan ordering phase, it went from you could get it in 2 days to 5 weeks or something ridiculous. We had a concrete shortage at one stage because there was a cement. Remember, there was a cement shortage. And
well, this is the thing. I'm glad you can, because that's the hardest thing about doing this is recalling. I remember there were some ups and downs of this journey. But so how did you bring the air tightness down? Because you mentioned, obviously, the program had fallen behind as well. So everyone was you were keen as well. You wanted to get back in.
Yes, well, that's right. The program fell behind partly because I have my contractors, like the windows guys and the like, who go from sort of an 8-week delivery to a 14-week delivery in the blink of an eye, and partly because on the other side, the contractors seem to have problems keeping people on site and getting people when you needed them, and et cetera, et cetera. So one of the more valuable things I did was to engage with my architect in an administration contract, which included a fortnightly visit on site, and that kept a level of professional focus on what was needed, what was coming up, where the timing was, what was being realistic, et cetera, because you get these promises, you'll be in by Christmas, but unless they're backed by a Gantt chart, contractors locked in to come on certain dates and no rain and no problems, and you really can't rely on just a feeling that you might be in by this time. It's very difficult.
I think there are lots of factors playing against each other, and we probably can't remember all of them anyway. But yeah, in terms of reducing that air tightness down, because there came a point when you realised that this was going to be an EnerPHit project rather than a passive house, which had been the goal from the beginning.
Yes, well, the goal was always to get to 0.6 air changes per hour, and I held on to that to the grim death, to be honest. As I said, I think we had 3 interim tests for the main house, and we weren't really doing the basement at that stage, which was a bit insane because, well, we should have been doing the basement probably at the same time, but that's perhaps another thing to talk about. But every time Faz came, he would leave us with a list of things to do, and those would get done, and so he would come back and it would show a lot of improvement. And then finally, we sort of got to a point where we said, right, we'll come along and we'll test the whole thing. And at that point, the main house had finished and we'd moved into it. The basement was really still looking like a building site, frankly, and I was probably not as focused on, because I was living in the house and I was sort of juggling all sorts of other things, and I wasn't quite as focused on how that basement was being developed. And so the day they came to do the final testing, we shut up the main house and left the basement open, and we got a result of 0.94, and that was pretty solid, right? And we also identified some other areas that where it was leaking. We identified one area where it was leaking, which I thought that was going to be pretty much unfixable because it was just too far into the guts of the house, if you like. So then when we went down to the basement, we closed up the basement and left the main house open, and that was terrible. That was like a 3 air changes per hour. So we got another chap in who actually is somewhat a legend of the air tightness industry, and we identified really a lot of where the air was coming in. Interestingly, there was a definite gap in the diathanite. So the diathanite had been done across to one side of a stud wall, and then the stud wall had been put up against the brick. And rather than the diathanite going right across that brick and then the stud wall going up into the diathanite. And so we pulled that away and patched that up. And we did a whole lot of other recommended patches. And I think they got the basement down to 0.98. And so what that meant was that the overall house, because it's really just a volumetric average, is about 0.95. Now, in the interim, we also did the work that we were asked to do or recommended in the main house. So I could have retested the main house, but based on how far we'd come and the work that we'd done, I really wasn't at all sure whether it was likely we were going to get to 0.6 in the main house. And we would have had to have got below 0.6 to have dragged the overall average, because there's about 80% of the volume of air in the main house and 20% in the basement. And so I kind of finished it at the point where I concluded that the EnerPHit standard was going to be perfectly acceptable. And frankly, in terms of comfort, I'm not sure how noticeable it is really. Is it disappointing we didn't get to 0.6? I mean, to some extent, yes. But also, now knowing how absolutely the Herculean size of getting this 4-level, 120-year-old terrace with a mix of new and old build and old bricks and leaking here and there, and getting that down to 0.95 overall was just an incredible achievement in itself. And it was going to be certified as Passive House and to the EnerPHit standard. And frankly, that's what the EnerPHit standard is about. It's really about recognising that the almost exponential effort in getting from 1 air change per hour to 0.6 air changes per hour in a property that's already built.
There was certainly pressure mounting on moving back in, and obviously when it's not habitable, it's clear you're not going to be moving back in. So where was this line then of knowing we should be moving back in, we're going to save money because we're not going to be renting, the house is far enough down the line that we can... Yeah, I think at one point, didn't you store some items here in one of the rooms because that had been completed? So how did you play that game?
Yeah, so when we moved out of our university terrace in Jericho, we were just really, by that stage, we were just in suitcases because we were going from hotel to aunt's place to hotel to wherever. So all of the things that we had over there, we brought back to our property, and that was the end of January. And it was a good 6 weeks before we moved back in. Did we move back in? Look, ideally, you move into a fully finished house. There's no doubt about it. But at a certain point, you kind of say, well, it's good enough. The bathrooms are working, the kitchen's working, it's warm enough, I can sleep in it, and it's finished to 90%. For example, the laundry wasn't finished, but you can live without a laundry. People change their laundry and live through the whole process, right? So we haven't lived in this property in any way that many other people wouldn't just live if they were just going to do a room or 2 rooms or change over a kitchen or something like that. So the reality is that you move in mid-March and it takes you to, mid-August to get things done. You didn't move in mid-March and you were probably fully in and everything was done in July, or, who knows really.
There's a pressure I think you can apply back when you're not moving in, no doubt about it. But I understand it's just life getting in the way a bit.
It is a bit,
Who would have predicted, though, that energy prices would increase to the extent that they have done? So what did that feel like? You had a roller coaster ride, but to be in this house now, knowing that you've not only got the renewables here, but you've got the fabric upgraded, you are ready.
That's very comforting. I certainly didn't foresee the email I was going to get from EDF this morning, essentially confirming that compared to this time last year, my unit electricity price is 3 times higher. Now, in an uncapped world, I could be looking at energy bills of 9,000 or 10,000, and I would say I'll be a fifth of that. But I should be a lot lower, obviously, if prices were a lot lower. But, the running costs, no doubt, will be lower in this scenario. That said, the upfront costs, I've put a lot of money into it. So it's
Is there any payback? Well, that's what people always ask, isn't it?
Well, I heard an interesting comment to the old payback argument the other day. And it's like, someone was asked what the payback on their solar PV was in terms of years. And I think their response was something like, I don't know, what's the payback on your effing kitchen? And so we're sitting here now in this house, and, it's 22 degrees and it's quite cold outside, and the next door room is 22 degrees, and, there's only really one hot room in the house. And so what value comfort? I think probably in some respects, the people I'm feeling most envious about today are those who have 10 kilowatts of solar PV on their roofs, who barely are going to face a single, because I've got rid of gas. We're all electricity. But, we've got a heat pump. It's a very good, efficient heat pump, and it heats and cools the house and also heats the hot water. So that will cost very little to run. We don't have any heating per se in the house apart from that. We charge the car. That's probably, I'd say, a third of our energy usage, to be honest, charging the car.
What other benefits have you felt from upgrading your property?
I could literally walk around this property in shorts and a T-shirt almost all year.
You've taken me back to the first day when I met you, and all the doors were closed. And coming from a passive house where you don't even think about it, I was thinking, why are all these doors all closed? But it was a refuge.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so the comfort levels are just an immense benefit. The quietness of the house is incredible. The stillness of the property, because of the lack of drafts and the like in it. I'm going to enjoy the next year because I always anticipated this kind of learning curve, and I've got all these toys, if you like. I've got this mechanical ventilation system, and I've got this heating system, and I've got these, electric towel rails, and I've got this heat pump, and I've got a control system, and I've got to try and make it work, and I've got to learn how to run this house in different conditions. I think this house will be a different house to run in winter versus summer, because I think we've opened ourselves up to potentially using a lot more solar gain in winter. But that's going to be a learning exercise, and I think that's one thing I'm looking forward to, being on that journey, really.
What lessons have you learnt that we haven't touched on?
I've been through building processes before, and so a lot of this is almost self-reinforcing. I think the importance of having a builder that you can communicate with, trying to have a stable relationship with the builder, try and avoid the yelly, screamy ups and downs, because changing your builder is a vastly complicated process, and it's made even more so when you're halfway through a passive house, and you wouldn't find another builder to want to take it on. So having a strong relationship with the builder is super important. Listen to your experts. They'll guide you through the process. Things always take longer than they're projected. I think that's almost a truism. I mean, what I've learned in the last 2-3 weeks is that there is an enormous appetite in Oxford and I think probably UK-wide, for all or some or most or half of the things that we've done to our property out there in the community. And I know that because we had an open home 2 Sundays ago, and in 4 hours we had 76 people through. I just was overwhelmed with the interest and the quality of the questions. And we have these open home weeks and open weeks in Oxford and lots of places around the UK. And often you go to some property to see their triple glazed windows, or you might go to some other property to see their air source heat pump. And you come to our property now to see kind of everything. We haven't got solar PV on the roof, and that was mainly an overt decision by me, that really the only roof that was suitable for it was the top roof, and that was only going to give us a kilowatts of potential solar, and I didn't think that was worth the trouble, to be honest. But given everything else that we were doing, it was just probably the straw that broke the camel's back. But apart from that, we've had a go at everything, and I think that's what attracted people to come and want to have a look around. But, my message is much more longer term than that. We need to be future-proofing our houses for a much less hospitable climate. And I like to think that that's what I've had a decent go at doing.
Well, a massive thank you to you for also let us film throughout for our hub videos. And I have learnt a ton as well. Congratulations. And once again, thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben. It's been a pleasure having you on the site, actually. And I do appreciate the record you've kept of the progress that we've made and the bumps along the way, and I'm looking forward to seeing the remaining videos coming out.
Head online to take a look at the show notes that accompany this session, houseplanninghelp.com/322. You can review the main learning points. Once again, we always give you that summary. Check out some photos as well, so you can get some visuals on what we have just been talking about. And of course, you can go in depth in the hub. We'll give you a link to do that to houseplanninghelp.com/322. And a big thank you to both Eco Design Consultants and Equus for letting us muscle in on the action as well. My call to action today is to check out our membership community, the hub, where we've just added a new course. This one is on build systems. So what approach are you going to take to your house construction? Do you know them all to begin with? What's interesting is there aren't absolutely thousands of them. It's really only a handful of approaches and a few very specialist approaches. So we look at that, the pros and cons. Why is masonry cavity wall such a big deal in England, Wales, Northern Ireland, but in Scotland, it's all about timber frame? And do you delegate this decision to your architect, or is this one you should do yourself? How do you choose? It's in this course. We put it all together. And also we've got all the regular stuff, the office hour calls if you want to chat with me, the private members only forum, our in-depth video case studies that we've been talking about, live trainings as well. We try and make this a continuation of the learning journey inside the hub. houseplanninghelp.com/join to find out more. Next time, I'm chatting to Nathan Gamblin from Beta Talk, the renewable energy and low carbon heating podcast. We're going to be looking specifically at air source heat pumps, and it's another one of those topics that we've talked about lots, but I don't think we've ever actually focused on it, so about time. Thank you so much for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.